The blood on Kade Patterson's shirt had dried stiff by the time he stumbled home through the pre-dawn darkness, leading his lame horse behind him while his hound dog Brutus limped along at his heels. The cattle rustlers had gotten away with half the herd, and he had taken a bullet that grazed his ribs deep enough to make every breath feel like fire. But at least he was alive, which was more than could be said for old Tom Jenkins, who had been riding fence with him when the shooting started. It was March of 1883, and the California hills around Oroville were still cold enough at night to make a man's teeth chatter, especially when he had lost as much blood as Kade had. He just wanted to collapse into his bed, tend to his wound, and figure out how he was going to explain to the ranch owner that 6 prime steers were gone and one of the best ranch hands was dead. But Brutus had other ideas. The moment they came within sight of Kade's small cabin on the edge of the Patterson family property, the old blue-tick coonhound stopped limping and started barking with an urgency that Kade had not heard in years. Brutus was 14 years old, gray around the muzzle, arthritic in the hips, and generally content to sleep by the fire and occasionally chase a rabbit he had no hope of catching. But now he was baying like he had treed the devil himself, and nothing Kade said could quiet him. "Brutus, hush now," Kade said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and pain. "There is nothing there, boy. Just let me get inside and rest." But Brutus would not hush. He bounded toward the cabin, then veered off toward the old barn where Kade kept his personal horse and the few chickens he raised for eggs. The dog's barking became almost frantic, and despite his exhaustion, Kade felt a cold finger of unease trace down his spine. Brutus was not the type to raise false alarms. If he was this worked up, something was wrong. Kade tied his lame horse to the fence post, checked that his revolver was still loaded despite the ache in his side, and followed the dog into the barn. The sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, casting everything in shades of gray and blue. Inside the barn, it was darker still, and Kade had to wait a moment for his eyes to adjust before he saw what Brutus was barking at. There, collapsed in a heap of dirty straw in the corner of an empty stall, was a woman. For a moment, Kade thought she might be dead. She was curled on her side, her dark hair matted and tangled around her face, her clothes torn and filthy. But then he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest, heard the rattling wheeze of her breathing, and he was moving before he could think, dropping to his knees beside her despite the white-hot pain that lanced through his ribs. Miss, can you hear me?" He touched her shoulder carefully, and even through the fabric of her dress, he could feel the scorching heat of her skin. Fever, a bad one, by the feel of it. The woman's eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused and glassy. She tried to speak, but all that came out was a cracked whisper that Kade could not make out. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and when he lifted her hand, he found her pulse racing beneath skin that felt like it was burning from the inside out. "Jesus!" Kade breathed. He looked at Brutus, who had stopped barking and was now whining anxiously, his tail tucked between his legs. "Good boy, Brutus, good boy." Kade assessed the situation quickly. The woman was burning up with fever, barely conscious, and clearly had been here for at least a few hours, maybe longer. She needed help, and she needed it fast. But Kade himself was injured, his horse was lame, and it was at least 5 miles to town, where the nearest doctor lived. Even if he could make it there, he did not know if the woman would survive the journey in her condition. He made a decision. He would take her into the cabin, get her warm and clean, try to get some water into her, and then ride for the doctor as soon as he had stabilized her enough to be left alone. It was not much of a plan, but it was all he had. Kade slid his arms beneath the woman, gritting his teeth against the pain in his side as he lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, almost frighteningly so, as though she had not eaten properly in days. She made a small sound of distress as he carried her out of the barn, but she did not wake, and that worried him more than anything else. Inside the cabin, Kade laid her on his bed and quickly built up the fire until the room was warm and bright. In the firelight, he got his first good look at her face, and something in his chest tightened. She was young, probably not much past 20, with delicate features and high cheekbones. Even filthy and fever-sick, she was beautiful. But more than that, there was something about her face that spoke of strength and determination, a set to her jaw that suggested she was a fighter. "Well, Miss Fighter," Kade murmured as he fetched a basin of water and some clean cloths, "let us see if we can get you through this." He spent the next hour carefully cleaning the dirt and grime from her face and hands, trying to get her to drink small sips of water and checking her over for injuries. He found bruises on her arms and a nasty cut on her calf that looked infected, which probably explained the fever. Her dress was torn in several places, and her shoes were so worn through that they were barely holding together. Whatever had happened to her, she had been through hell. Kade cleaned and bandaged the cut on her leg as best he could, using some of the same supplies he had planned to use on his own wound. His ribs could wait. The woman's fever was more pressing. He managed to get her to swallow a few more sips of water, then sat back and studied her, trying to figure out what to do next. That was when she started to talk. It was not coherent speech, just fevered rambling, words tumbling out in a breathless rush that Kade could only catch pieces of. "Please, not again. Have to keep moving. They cannot find me." She thrashed weakly against the blankets, her face twisting with fear and pain. "Shh," Kade soothed, placing a cool cloth on her forehead. "You are safe here. Nobody is going to hurt you." "Father, please." The word came out as a sob, and Kade felt his heart clench. I will not marry him." That gave Kade pause. A forced marriage? Was that what she was running from? It would explain the desperation in her voice, the fact that she had ended up alone and sick in a stranger's barn. He had heard stories of women running away from arranged marriages, from men who would hurt them, from families that did not care about their happiness. But he had never expected to find one collapsed in his barn at dawn. "You do not have to marry anyone you do not want to," Kade said softly, even though he was not sure she could hear him. "I promise you that." The woman's eyes opened again, and for just a moment, they focused on his face. They were gray, he realized, the color of storm clouds, and even fever, bright and confused. They were striking. "Who?" she whispered. "My name is Kade," he told her. "Kade Patterson. You are in my cabin, just outside Oroville. You are safe." "Oroville," she repeated, and something like relief flickered across her face. Made it far enough. Far enough from what? Kade asked, but she had already slipped back into unconsciousness, her body going limp against the pillows. Kade sat back with a sigh, pressing a hand to his own injured side. The bleeding had stopped at least, but the wound throbbed with every heartbeat, and he knew he should clean and bind it before infection set in. But every time he started to get up, he found himself looking back at the woman in his bed, worried that if he looked away for too long, she would stop breathing. Brutus solved the problem by patting over and pressing his nose into Kade's palm, his brown eyes worried. "I know, boy," Kade said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "She is in a bad way, but we are going to help her, all right? We are going to make sure she pulls through." The dog huffed as if he understood, then went and lay down beside the bed, his chin on his paws, his eyes fixed on the woman's face. Kade smiled despite himself. Brutus had always been a good judge of character, and if the old dog thought this woman was worth protecting, then Kade was inclined to agree. He finally forced himself to tend to his own wound, cleaning it with whiskey that made him hiss through his teeth, and binding it with strips of clean cloth. It was not pretty, but it would do until he could get to a proper doctor. Then he made himself eat something, even though he had no appetite, because he knew he would need his strength for whatever was coming. As the sun rose fully over the hills, painting the cabin in warm golden light, Kade sat in the chair beside his bed and watched the woman sleep. Her breathing was still labored, her fever still dangerously high, but she was alive, and as long as she was alive, there was hope. "Who are you?" he murmured, studying the delicate line of her profile. "And what were you running from?" He did not expect an answer, not yet, but he found himself determined to find out. And more than that, determined to make sure that whatever she was running from never caught up with her. He had been unable to save Tom Jenkins last night, unable to stop the rustlers or recover the stolen cattle. But maybe, just maybe, he could save this woman. It was a strange thought for a man who had spent the last 10 years focused solely on work and survival, who had sworn off romance after his sweetheart had left him for a richer man back when he was 22. Kade was 30 now, and he had convinced himself that he was perfectly content with his solitary life, his small cabin, his work on the ranch, and his faithful dog for company. But something about this woman, lying fevered and vulnerable in his bed, made him want to be more than that, made him want to be the kind of man who could protect someone, who could offer safety and comfort and a place to call home. Foolish, he told himself. but he did not look away from her face. By mid-morning, Kade knew he could not put off getting help any longer. The woman's fever showed no signs of breaking, and he was worried about that infected cut on her leg. He needed medicine he did not have, knowledge he did not possess. He needed Dr. Harrison from town. The problem was leaving her alone, but he had no choice. He checked that she was as comfortable as possible, left water within easy reach if she woke, and instructed Brutus to stay and watch over her. The old dog took his duty seriously, settling down beside the bed with a solemn expression that would have been comical under other circumstances. Kade saddled his personal horse, a sturdy bay mare named Rosie, who was thankfully sound and rested, and set out for Oroville at a pace that made his ribs scream in protest. The 5 miles felt like 50, but he made it to town in good time, riding straight to Dr. Harrison's house on Main Street. The doctor was a gray-haired man in his 50s, competent and steady, though known to charge steep fees for his services. But when Kade explained the situation, Harrison grabbed his bag without hesitation and did not mention money. A woman, you say, burning up with fever and an infected wound? Harrison climbed onto his own horse with surprising agility for a man his age. We had better hurry, son. Infections like that can kill faster than you would think. They made the ride back in tense silence, Kade pushing Rosie as hard as he dared while trying to ignore the pain in his side. When they reached the cabin, he was off his horse before Rosie had fully stopped, bursting through the door with his heart in his throat, terrified that he would find the woman dead and cold. But she was still breathing, still alive, though her face was flushed and her hair damp with sweat. Brutus looked up as they entered, his tail wagging weakly in relief. Dr. Harrison immediately set to work, examining the woman with quick, efficient movements. He checked her fever, inspected the cut on her leg, listened to her breathing, and asked Kade a dozen questions about when he had found her and what symptoms she had shown. The infection is bad, Harrison said finally, pulling out various bottles and instruments from his bag. But I have seen worse. The fever is the biggest concern right now. We need to get her temperature down, and we need to clean this wound properly. It is going to be painful for her, even in her current state. I will need you to hold her still. Kade nodded, moving to the side of the bed and placing his hands gently but firmly on the woman's shoulders. Harrison went to work, cleaning the infected wound with solutions that made the woman cry out and thrash weakly despite her unconscious state. It took everything Kade had not to push the doctor away, not to tell him to stop hurting her. But he knew this was necessary if she was going to survive. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Harrison sat back with a satisfied nod. There, I have done all I can. The rest is up to her and the good Lord. Keep her cool, get as much water into her as you can, and change the dressing on that wound twice a day. If the fever does not break in the next 24 hours. He did not finish the sentence, but he did not have to. I understand, Kade said quietly. Harrison turned his attention to Kade for the first time, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the way Kade was holding his side. You are hurt. It is nothing, just a graze. Let me see it. Kade reluctantly pulled up his shirt, revealing the bloody bandage wrapped around his ribs. Harrison hissed through his teeth. That is more than a graze, son. You should have said something. She needed help more than I did. Harrison gave him a long look, something like approval flickering in his eyes. You are a good man, Kade Patterson. Your father would be proud. He cleaned and rebandaged Kade's wound properly, pronouncing that it should heal fine as long as Kade kept it clean and did not do anything foolish like getting into another gunfight. Before Harrison left, he paused in the doorway and looked back at the woman in the bed. Do you know who she is? No, Kade admitted. She has not been conscious enough to tell me. Well, when she wakes up, you might want to ask her what she is running from. A woman does not end up in that condition by accident. Someone, somewhere, is probably looking for her. Then they had better hope they do not find her, Kade said, his voice harder than he intended. Harrison raised an eyebrow, but did not comment. I will check back in a few days. Send for me sooner if the fever gets worse or if she shows signs of distress. And Kade, get some rest yourself. You are not going to be any good to her if you collapse from exhaustion. After the doctor left, Kade did try to rest, stretching out on the old sofa near the fire, while Brutus kept watch over the woman. But every time he started to drift off, he would hear her make some small sound, and he would be on his feet in an instant, checking to make sure she was still breathing, still fighting. The day passed slowly, measured in small victories. He managed to get her to drink a few more sips of water. Her breathing seemed to ease slightly. The angry red around the wound on her leg looked a little less inflamed after Harrison's treatment. They were tiny things, but Kade clung to them like lifelines. Night fell, and still the fever raged. Kade sat beside the bed, changing the cool cloth on her forehead every few minutes, watching the play of firelight across her face. She was so still, so pale beneath the fever flush, and he found himself talking to her, filling the silence with stories about the ranch, about Brutus, about the hills around Oroville, and how beautiful they were in the spring when the wildflowers bloomed. "You would like it here, I think," he said softly. "It is quiet, peaceful, a good place to heal, to start over. Whatever you are running from, whatever happened to you, it does not have to define you. You can build a new life here if you want one." He did not know why he was making such promises to a woman he did not even know, a woman who might not even survive the night. But something about her called to him, made him want to protect her, to offer her everything he had. It was irrational and foolish and completely unlike the practical, level-headed man he had always been. But then, love had never been practical or level-headed, had it? The thought startled him. Love? He had known this woman for less than a day. He did not even know her name. How could he possibly be falling in love with her? And yet, as he sat there in the firelight, watching over her with Brutus snoring softly at his feet, Kade could not deny what he was feeling. It was more than just a desire to help someone in need. It was something deeper, something that had taken root in his chest the moment he had seen her lying in that barn, fighting for every breath. "You have to pull through," he whispered, taking her hand in his. Her skin was still burning hot, but her fingers curled weakly around his, and that small response felt like a miracle. "You have to wake up so I can learn your name, so I can hear your voice when you are not delirious with fever, so I can see your eyes when they are clear and focused. Please, just fight a little longer." The night stretched on, endless and dark, and Kade did not leave her side. Somewhere in the deep hours before dawn, when the world was at its quietest and coldest, the woman stirred. Kade, who had been dozing in the chair with his head on his arms, jerked awake at the sound of her voice. "Water," she whispered, the word barely audible, but blessedly clear. Kade nearly knocked over the water pitcher in his haste to pour her a cup. He slid his arm beneath her shoulders, lifting her gently so she could drink, and this time she managed several real swallows before falling back against the pillows with exhausted sigh. "Thank you," she murmured, and her eyes opened, fixing on his face with a clarity that had been absent before. "How do you feel?" Kade asked, hardly daring to hope. "Like I was trampled by a horse," she said, and incredibly there was a hint of humor in her voice. "Where am I?" "My cabin, just outside Oroville, California. I am Kade Patterson. My dog found you in my barn yesterday morning. You were burning up with fever." She processed this slowly, her brow furrowing. "Oroville," she repeated just as she had before. "I made it to Oroville. Where were you trying to get to?" "Anywhere," she said simply. "Anywhere far enough away that he could not drag me back." "He?" She was quiet for a long moment, and Kade thought she might not answer. But then she said, "My father, or rather, the man he wanted to sell me to. I suppose it amounts to the same thing." Her voice was bitter, tired. "My name is Catherine Garrett, and I am a runaway bride." The name suited her, Kade thought. Catherine. It was strong and elegant, just like she seemed to be, even sick and exhausted. "What happened?" he asked gently. Catherine closed her eyes, and Kade saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. "My father is a businessman in Sacramento, successful, wealthy, and completely without conscience. When a business associate of his, a man named Victor Brennan, expressed interest in marrying me, my father agreed without even asking my opinion. Victor is 52 years old, a widower, and known to have beaten his first wife before she died, under mysterious circumstances. I told my father I would not marry him. My father told me I did not have a choice." Kade felt anger kindle in his chest, hot and fierce. "So you ran?" "So I ran," Catherine confirmed. "I took what money I could steal from my father's study, bought a train ticket to Marysville, and then hired a man to take me farther east by wagon. I thought if I could get to somewhere small and remote, somewhere Victor would not think to look for me, I might have a chance to disappear." She laughed, a hollow sound. But the man I hired was more interested in robbing me than helping me. He took my money and left me stranded about 10 miles outside of Oroville, in the middle of the night. I tried to walk, but I cut my leg on some barbed wire, and then the fever started, and she trailed off, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I do not remember much after that, just walking until I could not walk anymore, and then finding some kind of building and collapsing inside it. I thought I was going to die there. You did not die, Kade said firmly. You are here, and you are safe, and that is what matters. Safe, Catherine repeated, as though testing the word. I do not think I have felt safe in months, not since Victor started coming to the house, looking at me like I was a piece of property he was thinking of purchasing. She shuddered. I could not do it. I could not let myself be sold like chattel, could not spend the rest of my life with a man who would likely kill me just as he killed his first wife. Even if it meant running with nothing, even if it meant dying alone in some stranger's barn, it was better than that. You are not going to die, Kade said, with more conviction than he felt. Her fever had broken, but she was still weak, still vulnerable. Dr. Harrison treated your wound, and you are going to heal. You are going to be fine. Catherine looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. Her gray eyes studied his face, taking in his features, and Kade found himself suddenly self-conscious about the stubble on his jaw, the tired lines around his eyes, the fact that he probably looked as rough as he felt after 2 days without proper sleep. But whatever Catherine saw seemed to satisfy her, because she gave him a small, genuine smile. You saved my life, she said softly. I do not know how to thank you for that. You do not have to thank me, Kade said, feeling his face heat. Anyone would have done the same. No, Catherine said, still smiling. They would not have. Most people would have turned me over to the sheriff, let him wire my father, and I would be on my way back to Sacramento by now. You did not even know me, and you took me in, cared for me, brought a doctor. Why? It was a fair question, and Kade did not have a good answer. Or, rather, he had an answer, but it felt too large and too frightening to speak aloud. So instead, he said, You needed help. That was reason enough. Catherine's smile turned sad. You are a good man, Kade Patterson, much better than most I have known. Before Kade could respond to that, Catherine's eyes fluttered closed again, and within moments she had slipped back into sleep. But this time, it was a natural sleep, not the fever-sick unconsciousness that had gripped her before. Her breathing was easy, her face peaceful, and when Kade carefully checked her forehead, he found her skin blessedly cool. The fever had broken. Kade sat back with a shaky exhale, feeling the tension that had been coiled tight in his chest for the past day finally begin to ease. She was going to be all right. Catherine was going to live. Brutus, who had been watching the entire exchange with interest, got up and padded over to Kade, pressing his head against Cade's leg. Kade reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, smiling despite his exhaustion. Good boy, Brutus, he murmured. You saved her life too, you know. If you had not started barking, I never would have found her in time. Brutus huffed, accepting the praise as his due, then went back to his spot beside the bed, ever the faithful guardian. As dawn broke for the second time since Kade had found Catherine, he finally allowed himself to believe that everything was going to be all right. The woman in his bed was going to heal. He was going to make sure of it. And after that, they would figure out what came next. The days that followed fell into a strange but comfortable routine. Catherine slept most of the time, her body working hard to heal from the infection and the fever. When she was awake, Kade brought her broth and water, helped her sit up to eat, and changed the dressing on her leg wound. It was awkward at first, especially given the intimacy required for some of the care, but Catherine seemed to take it in stride, and Kade tried his best to be professional and respectful. They talked too in the hours when Catherine was awake and strong enough for conversation. Kade learned that she was 23 years old, that she had been raised in Sacramento in a wealthy household with all the privileges and none of the freedom that came with money. Her mother had died when Catherine was 12, leaving her at the mercy of a father who saw her as little more than a bargaining chip in his business dealings. I thought about running before, Catherine admitted one afternoon, about 4 days after Kade had found her. She was sitting up in bed now, looking much stronger, though still pale and too thin. But I had nowhere to go, No money of my own, no skills that would let me support myself. I was trapped in a gilded cage, and I knew it. But when Father told me about Victor, when he made it clear that my refusal meant nothing to him, I knew I had to take the chance. Even if I failed, even if I ended up destitute or dead, it had to be better than marrying that monster. You did not fail, Kade said quietly. He was sitting in the chair beside the bed, mending a hole in one of his shirts and trying not to stare at her. It was getting harder not to stare, now that she was awake and alert and so very present. You are here. You are safe. That is not failure. I am here because you saved me, Catherine corrected gently. If you had not found me, I would have died in that barn. But I did find you, and now you get to decide what comes next, without your father or Victor Brennan or anyone else telling you what to do. Catherine looked at him for a long moment, something soft and wondering in her eyes. Do you know, she said slowly, that you are the first man who has ever spoken to me like I have agency? Like my choices and opinions matter? Even the men who claim to care about me, they always assumed they knew what was best for me, that my role was to listen and obey. Kade felt his jaw tighten. Then they were fools. Maybe, Catherine said, and there was that small smile again, the one that made Cade's heart do strange things in his chest. Or maybe I was just unlucky until now. Kade did not know how to respond to that, so he focused on his mending, trying to ignore the way his pulse had picked up. It was getting harder to pretend that what he felt for Catherine was simple compassion or a desire to help someone in need. Every day, as she grew stronger and more herself, he found himself falling deeper into something that felt dangerously like love. It was ridiculous. He had known her for less than a week. He was a simple ranch hand with a small cabin and modest savings. She was a wealthy woman from Sacramento, educated and refined, completely out of his league. Even if she was running from her old life, that did not mean she would want to stay in his new one. Once she was healed, she would probably move on, find some place where she could build a life for herself, and Kade would go back to his solitary existence. The thought made his chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with his healing wound, but he kept those thoughts to himself, determined to give Catherine the space and time she needed to heal without burdening her with his feelings. She had been through enough without having to deal with an infatuated cowboy making things complicated. On the 5th day, Catherine was strong enough to stand and walk a few steps around the cabin, leaning on Cade's arm for support. It was slow going, and her injured leg was still tender, but the infection had cleared up nicely, and Dr. Harrison, who came by to check on her, pronounced himself pleased with her progress. "You are a lucky woman, Miss Garrett," Harrison said as he packed up his bag. "Another few hours without treatment, and we would be having a very different conversation right now." "I know," Catherine said, glancing at Kade. "I owe Mr. Patterson my life." "Well, he seems determined to make sure you keep it," Harrison said, with a knowing look that made Kade want to sink through the floorboards. "You are in good hands, Miss Garrett. I will check in again next week, but I expect you will be well on your way to a full recovery by then." After Harrison left, Catherine turned to Kade with a thoughtful expression. "He thinks there is something between us," she said bluntly. Kade felt his face heat. "I am sorry if that made you uncomfortable. I will speak to him." "Why would it make me uncomfortable?" Catherine asked, tilting her head slightly. "Would it be so terrible if there was?" Kade stared at her, his mind suddenly blank. What?" Catherine laughed, and it was the first time Kade had heard her truly laugh, bright and genuine. The sound of it made something warm unfurl in his chest. "I am sorry," she said, still smiling. "I should not tease you. You have been nothing but kind and respectful, and here I am making you blush like a schoolboy. It is just, I am not used to being around someone who treats me like a person instead of a possession. It is refreshing. You are refreshing." "I am just being decent," Kade managed, still feeling off balance. "Exactly," Catherine said softly, "and that is rarer than you might think." Over the next week, Catherine continued to grow stronger. She started helping around the cabin, insisting that she needed to earn her keep, even though Kade protested that she was still recovering. She proved to be surprisingly capable, cooking meals that were far better than anything Kade had managed on his own, mending his worn clothes with neat, precise stitches, and even helping tend to the chickens. "I am not completely useless," she said with a wry smile when Kade expressed surprise at her domestic skills. "Just because I was raised in a wealthy household does not mean I was idle. My mother taught me to sew and cook before she died, and I spent a lot of time in the kitchen with our housekeeper after that. It was one of the few places my father did not bother me. They fell into an easy partnership, working side by side during the days and talking by the fire in the evenings. Kade told her about his life on the ranch, about growing up in California when it was still rough and wild, about the parents he had lost to cholera when he was 18, and how he had been working the Patterson family ranch ever since. Catherine told him about Sacramento, about the books she loved to read and the music she had learned to play on the piano her mother had cherished. "Do you miss it?" Kade asked one evening. "The life you had before?" Catherine considered the question carefully. "I miss some things," she admitted. "I miss my mother's piano. I miss having access to books whenever I wanted them. I miss feeling clean and well-dressed." She looked down at herself, at the simple dress she wore that Kade had bought for her in town, and laughed. "But do I miss the life itself? The constant pressure to be perfect, to smile and nod, and never have an opinion of my own? The fear of my father's temper? The knowledge that I was nothing more than a pawn in his business games? No, I do not miss that at all." "What will you do?" Kade asked, even though part of him did not want to know the answer. "When you are fully healed, I mean. Will you go back to Sacramento?" "Never," Catherine said, with such vehemence that Brutus, dozing by the fire, lifted his head in concern. She reached down to pat the dog reassuringly. "I will never go back there. My father made his choice when he tried to force me to marry Victor. I would rather live as a pauper in some tiny town where no one knows my name than ever set foot in that house again." "You would not have to live as a pauper," Kade said before he could stop himself. "You could. I mean, if you wanted, you could stay here." Catherine looked at him, her gray eyes unreadable in the firelight. "Stay here?" she repeated carefully. Kade felt his courage faltering, but he pressed on. "Just until you figure out what you want to do next. You would have a place to stay, food to eat, and you would be safe. That is all I'm offering," he added quickly, not wanting her to think he expected anything in return. "Just a place to be safe while you decide what comes next." "Why?" Catherine asked, and there was something vulnerable in her voice. "Why would you do that for me? You do not know me, Kade. For all you know, my father and Victor could show up on your doorstep tomorrow, and you would be in danger for harboring me." "Let them come," Kade said, surprised by the fierceness in his own voice. "I am not afraid of them. And as for why, because I want to. Because the thought of you leaving, of not knowing if you are safe or if you have enough to eat, or if you are all right, it makes me feel like someone is squeezing my heart in a vice. Because in the 2 weeks since I found you, you have become important to me. More important than you should be, probably. But there it is." The silence that followed was deafening. Kade stared into the fire, not daring to look at Catherine, certain that he had just ruined everything by admitting too much too soon. But then Catherine said, very quietly, "You have become important to me, too." Cade's head snapped up, and he found Catherine looking at him with tears shining in her eyes. "I know it is too fast," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I know that, logically, we have only known each other for a short time, and I should not feel this way. But Kade, when I look at you, I see someone who is good and kind and decent in a way I did not think men could be. Someone who risked his own safety to save a stranger, who has asked for nothing in return except that I get better. You make me feel safe. You make me feel valued. And that is not something I can just ignore or walk away from." "Catherine," Kade breathed, hardly daring to hope. "So yes," Catherine said, smiling through her tears. "I would like to stay, for as long as you will have me." Kade crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, sinking to his knees beside her chair. He took her hands in his, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. "Then stay," he said. "Stay as long as you want, forever, if you will." "Forever is a long time," Catherine said softly, but she was still smiling. "Not long enough," Kade replied, and then, because he had already laid his heart bare and had nothing left to lose, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and sweet, more a question than a declaration. But when Catherine's hands came up to cup his face, when she kissed him back with a warmth that made his heart soar, it felt like the answer to every question he had been afraid to ask. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "So," Catherine said, a little breathless, "I suppose this means we are courting now?" "I suppose it does," Kade agreed. and kissed her again just to be sure. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Cade's life. Catherine continued to grow stronger, the last traces of her illness fading away until she was fully healed. She took to life in the cabin with an enthusiasm that surprised them both, throwing herself into the daily tasks with a determination that spoke to how much she valued her newfound freedom. Cade introduced her to the ranch owner, a gruff but fair man named Samuel Hughes, and explained that Catherine was a friend who had fallen on hard times and would be staying with him for the foreseeable future. Hughes gave Cade a long, searching look, but did not press for details, and even offered Catherine work helping his wife with the household accounts if she was interested. Catherine accepted gratefully, glad for the chance to earn her own money and contribute. They were careful to maintain propriety, aware that small-town gossip could be vicious. Catherine slept in Cade's bed while he took the sofa, and they were always chaperoned when they went into town together. But in the privacy of the cabin, they allowed themselves the freedom to be close, to hold hands and steal kisses and dream about what their future might look like. "I never thought I could be this happy," Catherine said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills. Brutus was sprawled at their feet, snoring contentedly. "In Sacramento, I felt like I was constantly holding my breath, waiting for the next disaster. But here, with you, I can finally breathe." "I know what you mean," Cade said, his arm around her shoulders. "I thought I was content before, but I was just going through the motions. You have made me realize what I was missing." Catherine turned to look at him, her gray eyes soft in the fading light. "What were you missing?" "You," Cade said simply, and kissed her temple. But their happiness was not destined to remain unchallenged. About 6 weeks after Cade had found Catherine in his barn, trouble arrived in Oroville in the form of 2 men in expensive suits asking questions about a missing woman. Cade heard about it from Samuel Hughes, who rode out to the cabin one morning with a grim expression on his weathered face. "There are men in town looking for someone," Hughes said without preamble. Described her as young, dark-haired, gray-eyed. Said she ran away from her family in Sacramento, and they are trying to bring her home. They have offered a reward for information. Cade felt his blood run cold. Beside him, Catherine had gone pale, her hand reaching instinctively for his. "What did you tell them?" Cade asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Nothing," Hughes said. "I did not like the look of them, and I do not care much for men who try to drag women back to places they do not want to be. But not everyone in town is going to be as circumspect. If they start asking the right questions of the right people, they are going to find out about the young woman staying out at your place." "Then we need to be ready," Cade said, his mind already racing through possibilities. Hughes nodded slowly. "You care about her." It was not a question. "I love her," Cade said, the words coming easily now, "and I am not going to let anyone take her away." "Then you might have a fight on your hands," Hughes warned. "These men look like they have money and connections. If they decide to make trouble for you, it could get ugly." "Let it get ugly," Cade said flatly. "I am not backing down." After Hughes left, Cade and Catherine sat in tense silence for a long moment. Finally, Catherine said, "You should let me go. If I leave, they will not have any reason to bother you." "No," Cade said immediately, taking her hands in his. "Absolutely not. We are not running, and I am not letting you face this alone. Cade, these men work for my father. He is wealthy and powerful, and he does not take no for an answer. If you defy him, he could ruin you. He could have you arrested on false charges or worse." "Then he can try," Cade said, "but he is going to have to go through me first." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you doing this? Why are you risking everything for me?" "Because I love you," Cade said, cupping her face in his hands. "Because you are the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I am not going to lose you. Not to your father, not to Victor Brennan, not to anyone." "I love you too," Catherine whispered, and kissed him fiercely as though she could seal the promise between them with the press of her lips. The confrontation came 2 days later. Cade had just returned from working the far pasture when he saw 2 horses tied up outside his cabin. His heart sank, but he squared his shoulders and walked inside, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. The 2 men from Sacramento were sitting in his cabin as though they owned it, while Catherine stood pressed against the far wall, her face white but her chin raised defiantly. Brutus was standing between her and the strangers, hackles raised and growling low in his throat. "Mr. Patterson, I presume," said the older of the two men, a silver-haired individual in an expensive suit. "My name is Charles Morton. I am an attorney representing Mr. Henry Garrett of Sacramento. This is Mr. Davis, my associate. We are here to retrieve Miss Catherine Garrett and return her to her father." "Miss Garrett is an adult," Cade said coldly. "She does not need to be retrieved. She is here of her own free will." "Miss Garrett is an unmarried woman living alone with a man who is not her family," Morton said smoothly. "Her father is understandably concerned about her welfare and her reputation. He has asked us to bring her home, where she can be properly cared for." "I am not going anywhere," Catherine said, her voice shaking but determined. "My father has no right to dictate my life. I am of age, and I choose to be here." "Your father is prepared to be reasonable," Morton continued, as though Catherine had not spoken. "He understands that you were confused and frightened when you ran away. He is willing to forgive this incident and even to reconsider the engagement to Mr. Brennan, provided you return home immediately and cease this embarrassing display." "Embarrassing display?" Catherine's voice rose, anger cutting through the fear. "Is that what you call saving my own life? Refusing to marry a man who murdered his first wife?" "Those are baseless accusations," Morton said, but there was something in his eyes that told Cade he knew exactly what kind of man Victor Brennan was. "In any case, your father has been quite clear. If you do not return home voluntarily, he is prepared to take legal action. Mr. Patterson here could be charged with kidnapping, for instance, or perhaps corruption of a minor, depending on how the judge wishes to interpret the situation." "Catherine is 23 years old," Cade said through gritted teeth, "and I did not kidnap her. I found her half dead in my barn and saved her life." "That is your version of events," Morton said with a thin smile. "A jury might hear a very different story, especially when Mr. Garrett's attorneys are the ones presenting the evidence. Men have been hanged for less, Mr. Patterson." The threat hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Cade felt Catherine's fear like a physical thing, and it made his own anger burn hotter. These men thought they could waltz in here and threaten him, threaten Catherine, and that they would simply fold like a house of cards. They were wrong. "Get out of my home," Cade said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. Morton raised an eyebrow. "I do not think you understand the situation, Mr. Patterson." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Cade said. "You are a hired thug in a fancy suit, trying to intimidate a woman into giving up her freedom. But here is what you do not understand. This is California, not Sacramento. We do things differently out here, and if you think you can threaten me on my own property, you have another thing coming." "Are you threatening us?" Morton asked, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes now. "I am telling you the facts," Cade said. "Catherine is an adult woman who has chosen to stay here of her own free will. You have no legal authority to force her to go anywhere, and any attempt to do so will be met with resistance. Now, get out before I have the sheriff come and remove you for trespassing." Morton stood slowly, his face darkening with anger. "You are making a very serious mistake, Mr. Patterson. Mr. Garrett is not a man who forgives easily. When he learns that you have refused to cooperate, he will make sure you regret it." "Then I will deal with that when it comes," Cade said. "But right now, you need to leave." The two men left, but not before Morton turned back at the door and said, "This is not over, Miss Garrett. Your father will not rest until you are home where you belong." After they were gone, Catherine collapsed into a chair, shaking. Cade knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms. "It is all right," he murmured. "They are gone. You are safe." "For how long?" Catherine asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "My father has resources I cannot even imagine. He will not stop coming after me, Cade. He will find a way to force me back, or to punish you for helping me. I cannot let that happen. Maybe I should just go with them, end this before anyone else gets hurt." "No," Cade said fiercely, pulling back to look her in the eyes. "Listen to me, Catherine. I meant what I said. I love you, and I am not going to let anyone take you away. Your father and his lawyers can threaten all they want, but they cannot force you to do anything. You are an adult with the right to make your own choices. But what if they try to have you arrested? What if they hurt you?" "Then I will fight back," Cade said simply. "But I am not giving up on you, on us. We will find a way through this. I promise." Catherine searched his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," she whispered. "We will fight." The solution came from an unexpected source. That evening, Samuel Hughes returned to the cabin with his wife Emma, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had always been kind to Catherine. Emma took one look at Catherine's tear-stained face and Cade's grim expression and immediately understood the situation. "So, Henry Garrett sent his dogs after you," Emma said bluntly, sitting down at the table uninvited. "I thought he might. Men like that do not take kindly to losing control of their possessions." "I am not his possession," Catherine said quietly. "I know that, dear," Emma said gently. "But he does not, which is why you need to make it impossible for him to claim otherwise." "How?" Cade asked. Emma looked between them, a knowing smile on her face. "You two love each other, yes?" "Yes," Cade and Catherine said in unison. "Then marry," Emma said simply. "Get married right away, before those lawyers can regroup and come back with some new scheme. Once you are Catherine Patterson, legally wed to Cade, your father will have no claim on you whatsoever. You will be your husband's responsibility, not his." Cade blinked. It was such an obvious solution that he could not believe he had not thought of it himself. But then doubt crept in. "Catherine and I have only known each other for 2 months, he said slowly. "Is that enough time to make such a decision?" "I knew I wanted to marry Samuel 2 weeks after I met him," Emma said with a smile. "We have been together 32 years now. Time is not what matters. What matters is whether you trust each other, whether you can see a future together. Can you?" Cade looked at Catherine, his heart in his eyes. "I can see a future with you," he said softly. "If you will have me. I know I do not have much to offer. Just this cabin, my work on the ranch, and my heart. But they are yours, if you want them." Catherine was crying again, but she was smiling too. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you, Kade Patterson. I cannot think of anything I want more." They were married 3 days later in a small ceremony at the Oroville Church, with Samuel and Emma Hughes as witnesses and half the town in attendance. Catherine wore a simple dress that Emma had helped her sew, white with blue trim, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Cade had picked from the hills that morning. She had never looked more beautiful. Cade wore his best suit, the one he had bought for his own father's funeral years ago, and tried not to shake as he took Catherine's hands in his before the pastor. The ceremony was short and simple, but when the pastor pronounced them man and wife and told Cade he could kiss his bride, it felt like the most important moment of Cade's entire life. "I love you, Catherine Patterson," he murmured against her lips. "I love you too," she whispered back, and kissed him again to the applause and cheers of their friends and neighbors. The celebration that followed was joyful and raucous, with dancing and food and more well wishes than Cade knew what to do with. But the best moment came later, when he and Catherine finally returned to their cabin, to find Brutus waiting on the porch with what Cade could have sworn was a satisfied expression on his grizzled face. "Well, boy," Cade said, scratching the old dog behind the ears, "I guess this all started with you, did it not? If you had not found her, if you had not started barking that morning, none of this would have happened." Brutus huffed and thumped his tail, accepting his due credit. Catherine laughed and bent down to hug the dog, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "Thank you, Brutus," she said softly. "Thank you for saving me." That night, as Cade held his wife in their bed for the first time as husband and wife, he marveled at how much his life had changed in just 2 months. He had gone from a lonely ranch hand with no prospects beyond the next day's work to a married man with a future full of hope and possibility. "What are you thinking?" Catherine asked, her head resting on his chest. "That I am the luckiest man alive," Cade said honestly, "and that I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret this," Catherine said, tilting her head up to kiss him. "You gave me my life back, Cade. You gave me freedom and safety and love. That is more than I ever dreamed of having. You deserve all of that and more," Cade said, tightening his arms around her. "And I am going to make sure you have it." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, Brutus snoring softly on the rug beside the bed, and Cade felt more at peace than he had in years. The legal threats from Henry Garrett did not materialize, whether it was because Catherine's marriage had made his claims legally void, or because even he recognized that pursuing the matter would only draw unwanted attention to his attempted coercion of his daughter. They never knew. Charles Morton and his associate left Oroville and did not return, and after a few tense weeks of waiting for the other shoe to drop, Kade and Catherine finally allowed themselves to believe that they were truly free. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Catherine continued to work with Emma Hughes on the ranch accounts, discovering that she had a head for numbers and business that surprised everyone, including herself. Kade continued his work on the ranch, but he found himself coming home each evening with a lightness in his step that had not been there before, eager to see his wife and hear about her day. They were not wealthy, but they were happy. They expanded the cabin, adding a second room that Catherine insisted would eventually be a nursery, though she blushed furiously when Kade teased her about being eager to fill it. They planted a garden and raised chickens and lived the simple, honest life that Catherine had once thought was beyond her reach. And through it all, Brutus remained their faithful companion, slower now and grayer, but still alert and watchful. He had saved Catherine once, and he seemed determined to remain her guardian for as long as his old bones would allow. About a year after their wedding, Catherine came to Kade with news that made his heart stop. "I am with child," she said, her eyes shining with joy and nervousness. "We are going to have a baby." Kade swept her into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "A baby," he repeated, hardly able to believe it. "Catherine, we are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, even though his reaction had made the answer obvious. "I am terrified and thrilled and so happy I think my heart might burst," Kade said honestly. "How are you feeling? Are you well? Do you need anything?" "I need you to stop fussing," Catherine said with a laugh. "I am pregnant, not made of glass. But yes, I am happy. I am so happy, Kade." Their son was born on a crisp October morning in 1884, with Emma Hughes serving as midwife, and Kade pacing nervously outside the bedroom door until Catherine's cries turned to the wailing of a newborn. When Emma finally emerged, smiling and tired, and told him he could come in, Kade nearly tripped over his own feet in his haste. Catherine was propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your son," she said softly, and Kade crossed the room on shaking legs. The baby was perfect, with a crown of dark hair and tiny fingers that wrapped around Kade's thumb when he offered it. "He is beautiful," Kade breathed, unable to take his eyes off the miracle in Catherine's arms. "He is perfect." "What should we name him?" Catherine asked. Kade thought for a moment, then smiled. "What about Thomas, after Tom Jenkins, the man who died the night I found you? He was a good man, and I think he would have liked knowing there was a child named after him." "Thomas Patterson," Catherine said, testing the name. "I like it. Thomas James Patterson, after both Tom and my mother, whose middle name was Jane." "Thomas James Patterson it is," Kade agreed, and leaned down to kiss his wife, and then his son's forehead. Brutus, who had been waiting anxiously outside the door, was finally allowed in to meet the baby. The old dog approached carefully, sniffing the bundle in Catherine's arms with interest. Then, satisfied that this new tiny human was part of his pack, he lay down beside the bed with a contented sigh, resuming his role as guardian. The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a healthy, happy child, full of curiosity and mischief. 2 years after Thomas was born, Catherine gave birth to a daughter they named Anna Marie, who had her mother's gray eyes and her father's stubborn determination. The cabin was expanded again to accommodate the growing family, and Kade took on more responsibilities at the ranch, eventually becoming the foreman when Samuel Hughes decided to step back from the day-to-day operations. Catherine continued her work with the ranch accounts, and her skill with numbers led to her being consulted by other ranchers in the area who needed help with their bookkeeping. She took pride in being able to contribute financially to the family, and Kade took pride in watching her thrive in ways she never could have in Sacramento. They never heard from Henry Garrett again. Catherine sometimes wondered what had become of her father, whether he ever regretted his treatment of her, but she did not dwell on it. She had built a new life, a good life, and the past had no hold on her anymore. Victor Brennan, they learned through a newspaper article a few years later, had been killed in a bar fight in San Francisco, stabbed by a man whose sister he had reportedly abused. Catherine felt no joy at the news, only a grim satisfaction that justice had been served in its own way, and relief that she had escaped the fate that might have been hers. Brutus lived to the impressive age of 19, finally passing peacefully in his sleep one winter night, with his head resting on Kade's foot. as though he wanted to be touching his family, even at the end. They buried him on the hill behind the cabin, under an oak tree where he had loved to rest in the shade, and Thomas and Anna both cried as they said goodbye to the dog who had been part of their lives for as long as they could remember. "He saved my life, you know," Catherine told the children as they stood over the grave. "If it was not for Brutus, I would never have met your father, and you would never have been born. He was a very special dog." "The best dog," Thomas agreed solemnly, and Anna nodded, clutching her mother's hand. Kade carved a simple marker for the grave. Brutus, 1869-1888. Faithful friend and guardian, he brought us together. Life went on, as it always does. Thomas grew into a young man who wanted to be a rancher like his father, while Anna showed signs of inheriting her mother's head for business. Kade and Catherine grew older together, their hair going gray, their hands becoming lined with the work of years, but their love never dimming. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Kade took Catherine up to the hill where they had buried Brutus, where they could look out over the land that had become their home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the air was sweet with the scent of wildflowers. "Do you ever regret it?" Kade asked, his arm around Catherine's waist. "Giving up the life you could have had in Sacramento for this?" Catherine looked at him as though he had gone mad. "Regret it? Kade, you saved me from a life that would have killed my spirit if not my body. You gave me freedom, love, children, a home where I am valued for who I am, not what I can do for someone else's ambitions. How could I possibly regret that?" "I just wanted to make sure," Kade said with a smile, "because I have never regretted a single moment. Finding you that morning, taking care of you, falling in love with you, it was the best thing that ever happened to me." "It was meant to be," Catherine said softly. "I truly believe that. Every terrible thing that happened, every hardship I endured, it all led me to you, to this life, and I would go through it all again in a heartbeat if I knew this was where I would end up." They stood together in the fading light, watching the sun sink below the hills, and Kade thought about that morning 20 years ago, when Brutus had started barking and refused to stop. He thought about the fevered, barely breathing woman he had found in his barn, and the strong, beautiful, capable woman she had become. He thought about all the ways their lives had intertwined, and all the moments, big and small, that had brought them to this point. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Catherine asked. "For being brave enough to run, for surviving long enough for me to find you, for choosing to stay, for loving me, for everything." Catherine turned in his arms and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. "Thank you for finding me," she said, "for saving me, for showing me what love is supposed to be, for giving me a life worth living." They walked back down the hill hand in hand as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, heading home to the cabin where their children waited, where the fire was warm and the supper was ready, and their life together continued in all its ordinary, extraordinary beauty. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist rose from the hills and the world was still and peaceful, Kade could have sworn he heard the distant sound of a dog barking, joyful and insistent, as though old Brutus was still out there somewhere, still watching over them, still making sure his family was safe and happy and together. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons changing. Thomas married a local girl named Sarah when he was 24, and they built their own cabin on a piece of land that Kade and Catherine gave them as a wedding gift. Anna, true to her independent nature, went to San Francisco to study at a business college, one of the few institutions willing to educate women in such matters. She wrote long letters home describing her adventures in the city, and Catherine read them aloud to Kade by the fire, both of them proud and slightly terrified of their daughter's boldness. Kade eventually retired from his position as foreman, handing the reins over to Thomas, who had proven himself to be as capable and hardworking as his father. Catherine continued to consult on ranch accounts until arthritis in her hands made writing difficult, at which point she taught Anna's younger sister, born when Catherine was 41, and whom they had named Grace, how to manage the complex bookkeeping systems Catherine had developed over the years. On their 30th anniversary, their entire extended family gathered at the original cabin for a celebration. Thomas and Sarah had brought their 3 children. Anna had returned from San Francisco with stories of her work as a bookkeeper for a shipping company, and Grace, now 16 and as sharp as her mother, helped organize the entire affair with military precision. As Cade looked around at the faces of his children and grandchildren, all of them healthy and happy and free to make their own choices in life, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. This was what he and Catherine had built together, not just a family, but a legacy of love and freedom and second chances. "What are you thinking about?" Catherine asked, settling into the chair beside him. They were both in their 60s now, their bodies showing the wear of long lives well lived, but Catherine's eyes were still the same storm gray that had captivated him when she had first woken up in his bed all those years ago. "I am thinking about how that morning changed everything," Cade said, taking her hand. "If Brutus had not started barking, if I had been too tired or injured to check the barn, if you had not been strong enough to survive until I found you, so many things could have gone differently. But they did not," Catherine said firmly. "We found each other, Cade. Against all odds, despite everything that should have kept us apart, we found each other. That is not chance. That is fate." "I used to think I did not believe in fate," Cade admitted. "I thought life was just a series of random events, that we had to make the best of whatever circumstances we were dealt. But you changed my mind about that, about a lot of things." "You changed my mind too," Catherine said softly. "I used to think that love was either a weakness or a fiction, something that existed in novels but not in real life. My parents' marriage taught me that. But you showed me that real love, true love, is the strongest thing in the world. It gave me the courage to run. It gave me a reason to survive. It gave me everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their family laugh and talk and enjoy each other's company. Thomas was telling his children the story of how their grandmother had arrived in Oroville, a tale that had grown somewhat embellished over the years, but still held the essential truth at its core. Anna was helping Grace with some mathematical problem, their heads bent together over a slate. Sarah was organizing the food with the efficiency of a general directing troops. "We did well, did we not?" Catherine said, and there was quiet pride in her voice. "We did," Cade agreed. "We did very well indeed." As the sun set on another day, painting the California hills in shades of gold and crimson, Cade pulled Catherine closer and reflected on the strange and wonderful path his life had taken. He had started as a simple cowboy, working hard and asking for nothing more than an honest day's pay. He had expected to live and die alone, maybe with a dog for company, leaving no mark on the world beyond the work of his hands. But then Brutus had started barking one dawn morning, and everything had changed. He had found a woman who was barely breathing, who should have died in his barn but had fought to survive. He had fallen in love with her courage and her strength and her refusal to accept the fate others had chosen for her. And in saving her, he had saved himself from a lonely, purposeless existence. Together, they had built something beautiful, a family, a home, a life full of love and laughter and the freedom to make their own choices. It was not a grand or glamorous life by the standards of Catherine's former world, but it was honest and true and entirely their own. And that, Cade thought, as Catherine's head rested on his shoulder and their grandchildren played in the fading light, was worth more than all the wealth and status in the world. The celebration lasted long into the night, with music and dancing and stories told and retold. When the last of the guests had finally departed and Cade and Catherine were alone in their cabin once more, they stood together on the porch, looking up at the stars. "Do you think Brutus is up there somewhere?" Catherine asked softly. "Watching over us still?" "I like to think so," Cade said, "and I like to think he is proud of what we built, of the family we made because he refused to stop barking that morning." "To Brutus," Catherine said, raising an imaginary glass to the sky. "The best dog who ever lived and the reason we found each other." "To Brutus," Cade echoed, "and to second chances.